doing here? What are you doing here? Agu! I saved your life. Go! All of you that have seen, you now have something that stands. Put the weapons of this war back in your hands of the powerful.
I'm a good follower.
Always protects your father.
Beasts of No Nation, 2015. These analyses and explanations provide a complete and detailed examination of the entire film, exploring its narrative, themes, and technical artistry. Beasts of No Nation immediately distinguishes itself as a harrowing and essential piece of cinema, functioning not merely as a story, but as an immersive, sensory experience designed to collapse the safe distance between the viewer and the unimaginable reality of a child soldier. The film's opening frames establish a deceptive piece, a deliberate directorial choice by Cary Joji Fukunaga to ground the coming horror in a recognizable world of childhood innocence, making the subsequent fall from grace all the more devastating. This constructed pre-war Eden, filled with the playful banter of Agu and his friends, is a crucial narrative device. It serves as a baseline of humanity against which every future act of dehumanization is measured. The film's title, drawn from a Fela Kuti album, operates on multiple levels of meaning, initially suggesting the lawlessness of a failed state, but deepening to signify the internal, spiritual condition of a child who feels utterly forsaken by nation, family, and God. Fukunaga, serving as his own cinematographer, translates this internal chaos into a visual language characterized by fluid, restless camera movements that haunt Agu like a ghost, refusing to look away from his transformation. The narrative perspective is relentlessly subjective, trapping the audience within Agu's consciousness. We are not told about his trauma, but are forced to experience its sensory texture. The deafening bass of a distant explosion, the psychedelic blur of a drug-fueled haze, the visceral stickiness of blood. This technical mastery ensures the film transcends political commentary to become a profound, almost unbearable psychological portrait. The inciting incident, the separation from Agu's mother and younger sibling, is staged with a casual brutality that establishes the random, senseless logic of civil war, where survival is a lottery and family bonds are severed in an instant. Agu's father's attempt to shield him by ordering him to wait behind is a poignant, futile gesture of patriarchal protection, a moment that underscores the complete powerlessness of civilian men in a conflict where traditional structures of authority have collapsed. The execution of Eiga's father is not a spectacle but a sharp, shocking rupture. Fukunaga frames it with a disorienting suddenness that mirrors Eiga's own traumatic shock, leaving a psychic wound that the commandant will later expertly exploit. Wandering in a jungle that functions as a primordial space of danger and transformation, Eiga is discovered by the rebel battalion, a ragtag militia whose visual introduction immediately destabilizes the heroic archetype of the guerrilla fighter. The film's first true descent into horror arrives with the initiation ritual, the forced killing of an unarmed man, a scene that acts as a dark baptism in which Eiga's old self is murdered alongside the victim. Idris Elba's commandant orchestrates this violence not as a mindless brute, but as a methodical teacher, his calm, paternal demeanor transforming the act of murder into a gruesome but necessary lesson, a corrupted rite of passage into a new, savage brotherhood. The character of Striker, the mute boy who becomes Eiga's silent companion, represents a form of psychological damage that has progressed beyond language itself, a living embodiment of trauma, so profound it can only be expressed through a haunted gaze and mimetic action. Their wordless bond is one of the film's most tender and tragic elements, a shared understanding forged in mutual suffering that provides the only remaining vestige of human connection, a childhood friendship perverted by the context of war. The commandant's charismatic monologues, delivered with the rhythm of a preacher and the guile of a politician, are masterclasses in manipulative rhetoric, where the language of liberation and brotherhood is weaponized to justify atrocity and bind the children to his personal ambition. The film's depiction of drug use among the child soldiers is not sensationalized but integrated into the narrative as a functional tool of warfare, a chemical means of erasing the moral instinct that would otherwise make killing psychologically impossible for a child. The hallucinatory sequence that follows their ingestion of gunpowder and brown transforms the screen into a fiery, slow-motion hellscape, an expressionistic burst of pure cinema that externalizes Eiga's fragmented, drug-scrambled interior state with terrifying poetry. Fukunaga's camera captures the village massacre not as a coherent, edited action scene, but as a chaotic, disorienting blur of motion, smoke, and screams, a directorial choice that prioritizes sensory immersion over spatial clarity, forcing the viewer into the same panic and confusion as the victims. The act of stomping a small girl to death is a point of no return, a threshold of evil that the film presents with a blunt, unflinching directness, implicating not just the perpetrators but the passive onlookers, including Eiga, in its horror. This specific atrocity is the moment the film's thesis on dehumanization becomes fully sickeningly realized, demonstrating that the ultimate victory of indoctrination is not just making a child a killer, but making them a killer without effect. The subsequent scene where the commandant congratulates his boys, praising them as brave soldiers, reveals the performative nature of his paternalism. His approval is a reward system designed to normalize the abnormal, to make the children crave validation for their capacity to commit unspeakable acts. The introduction of the character Rambo, the loyal lieutenant, establishes a fault line of tension within the battalion, his silent, observing presence a slow-burning fuse that will eventually ignite a mutiny driven not by morality, but by pure, practical self-interest over food and resources. The film's middle act shifts from a focus on external warfare to the internal decay of the rebel group, a microcosm of how revolutionary movements often devour themselves when the charismatic center loses its ability to provide. The commandant's interactions with the supreme leader, a detached and bureaucratic warlord, reveal his own position in a chain of exploitation. His godlike power over the children is instantly deflated in the presence of his superior, exposing his bullying as the cowardice of a middle manager of violence. Striker's death, a quiet, pathetic passing from a bullet wound, is stripped of all cinematic glory. He simply sits against a tree and dies, a stark refusal to grant even a meaningful death to a child who is systematically stripped of his personhood. Eiga's grief over Striker is a primal, wordless howl, a moment where the carefully constructed soldier's mask slips completely to reveal the terrified, heartbroken child beneath, and it marks the beginning of his internal rebellion against the commandant's totalizing narrative. The explicitly implied sexual abuse by the commandant is woven into the film's text with a chilling subtlety, most notably in the predatory ritual of the bedtime blessing, a grotesque perversion of paternal affection that adds a layer of unspeakable, intimate violation to the physical and psychological violence. The mutiny led by Rambo is a desperate, ugly affair, a revolution not of ideals but of starving men, and the commandant's loss of control is a study in the fragility of power built on fear and charisma once the physical basis of that power, food, bullets, strength, evaporates. Aga's escape into the jungle is a journey into a completely different kind of wilderness, a green, silent purgatory where he is alone with his memories and his guilt, a ghost drifting through a landscape that offers no clear path to salvation. The arrival of the UN peacekeepers is treated not as a heroic rescue, but with the alien, bureaucratic detachment of an occupying force, their massive vehicles and sterile protocols representing a world that Aga can no longer comprehend. The missionary shelter, with its whitewashed walls and orderly routines, feels like a space station on another planet, a place of surreal peace where Aga must learn to exist in a body that has ceased to be a weapon. His interactions with Amy, the aid worker, are fraught with a disconnection that illustrates the vast chasm between the language of therapy and the unspeakable reality of his experience, a gulf that can only be bridged by time, patience, and a tentative rebuilding of trust. The film's final, devastating monologue, delivered directly to the camera, is Abraham Attah's crowning achievement, a confession and a plea delivered with a self-awareness that is both shattering and unexpectedly hopeful. Aga's admission that he did terrible things because he had become a beast, a thing with no nation, is a radical act of self-reclamation, a boy naming his own dehumanization as the first step toward reclaiming his humanity. The final image of Aga wading into the ocean, surrounded by other recovering child soldiers, is an ambiguous benediction, a moment of fleeting, playful freedom that does not promise a happy ending, but rather the possibility of continuing to live. Kari Joji Fukunaga's screenplay streamlines Uzodinma Iweala's novel's internal monologue into a purely cinematic language of image and sound, a feat of adaptation that respects the source material while forging a work of art that stands powerfully on its own terms. The film's deliberate choice to set the conflict in an unnamed nation is a double-edged sword, successfully universalizing the story of the child soldier as a global, timeless tragedy while also opening itself to valid critiques of decontextualizing an inherently political, historical, and specifically African reality. Abraham Attah's performance is a miracle of naturalism, his eyes carrying the entire film's moral weight, charting a journey from the luminous curiosity of childhood to a deadened, hollow stare and, finally, to a glimmer of resurrected feeling. Idris Elba's Commandant is a towering cinematic villain precisely because he is never a simple monster. He is a product of the same systemic failure, a man whose intelligence and magnetism are twisted into instruments of cruelty, making his brand of evil recognizable and terrifyingly human. The sound design of the film is a masterwork of psychological dread, using a suffocating low-end bass to simulate the physical pressure of approaching danger, making the war a presence that is felt in the viewer's chest before it is ever seen. The color palette transitions from the warm, sun-bleached yellows and greens of the pre-war village to the desaturated, blood-soaked reds and ashen grays of the conflict, a visual degradation that mirrors Aga's moral and spiritual decay. The film refuses any catharsis through righteous violence. Every death is messy, pointless, and grim, stripping war of any romanticism and presenting it as a perpetual motion machine of human misery. Fukunaga's negotiation with the child actors to film the more disturbing sequences involved a protective, workshop-based approach that created a safe, game-like environment, a remarkable ethical feat that allowed for the film's brutal honesty without traumatizing its young performers. The film stands as a landmark moment in the history of distribution, Netflix's first original feature, proving that a streaming platform could produce and deliver auteur-driven, uncompromisingly difficult art on a global scale, challenging the theatrical establishment. Its lack of major Academy Award recognition remains a point of controversy, widely interpreted as a punitive response from an industry threatened by the film's groundbreaking release model, a snub that inadvertently proved the system's resistance to change. The character of Aga's mother exists primarily as a sacred memory, a talismanic image of warmth and song that Aga clings to as proof of a former life, her absence a void that the Commandant's corrupted paternal energy seeks to fill. The Bible Aga carries, a gift from his mother, becomes a complex symbol, first of his stolen innocence and later a burdensome object of divine judgment. His plea that God, I am not a beast, is a prayer offered from the depths of a hell where God seems completely absent. The film's refusal to subtitle the local dialects spoken by some characters is a deliberate political and aesthetic choice, placing the audience in the same position of linguistic alienation as the young, terrified villagers, stripping us of the comfort of full understanding. The choreography of the battles is anti-balletic. Soldiers stumble, run haphazardly, and shoot wildly, a chaotic, unprofessional energy that is far more frightening than the precision of a Hollywood firefight. The scene where the battalion discovers a woman and child is a masterclass in building tension without dialogue. The predatory silence and the commandant's casual decision-making a more chilling depiction of power than any shouted order could ever be. The bond between the child soldiers is forged in a crucible of shared guilt. They have killed together, and this co-participation in atrocity creates a perverted intimacy, a brotherhood that is also a chain. The concept of a nation is systematically dismantled. For the commandant, it is a rhetorical tool. For the supreme leader, a seat of power. And for Egu, a ghost that has failed to protect him, leaving him a beast of no nation. The editing during the raid sequences is a staccato barrage of images, a fragmented, percussive rhythm that replicates the broken perception of a traumatized mind trying to process sensory overload. The film's brief moments of quiet, like the soldiers resting in a captured village or playing in a stream, are charged with an almost unbearable poignancy, phantom glimpses of the childhood they should have had. The casting of predominantly non-professional Ghanaian actors lends the film a documentary-like authenticity, their faces and body language carrying the specific gravity of lived experience that trained actors can only emulate. Fukunaga's wide shots of the African landscape are never merely picturesque. They dwarf the human figures, framing the conflict as a small, ugly stain on an indifferent, eternal natural world that will outlast all the armies. The commandant's rhetoric about killing the soil that grows the enemy's crops is a stark articulation of total war, a strategy of annihilation that targets life itself at its roots, which the children enact with literal-minded horror. Ega's confession that he likes the feeling of killing, of being powerful, is the film's most damning and honest statement on how violence can seduce its victims, offering a pathological solution to the feelings of helplessness and terror. The film is a profound act of empathy that refuses the easy consolation of sentimentality. It does not ask us to pity Egu so much as to witness him, to acknowledge the full, complex, and damning truth of his transformation. It functions as a searing indictment not just of the obvious villains, the warlords and commanders, but of a global order that allows such a nationless reality to exist, where a child can fall through every crack and be reforged into a weapon. The legacy of Beasts of No Nation lies not only in its artistic achievements, but in its real-world impact, most tangibly in the educational scholarship provided to Abraham Attah, a concrete gesture that transformed a simulation of rescue into an actual one. The film's structure is a classic tragedy in reverse, beginning with wholeness and slowly, systematically stripping everything away. Family, name, faith, conscience, until only a naked human soul remains, trembling between total annihilation and the agonizing first step of recovery. Its enduring power is its refusal to provide a clear answer to Ega's final question, leaving the audience with the same fragile, terrifying, and sacred hope he must learn to carry. That a boy who has been a beast can, maybe, learn to be a child again. The soundscape of this pre-war world is rich with diegetic detail. The chirping of insects, the rhythmic pounding of yams, the melodic cadence of his mother's voice. A symphony of everyday life that the film will gradually replace with a discordant orchestra of gunfire, screams, and the oppressive, thrumming bass of military vehicles. This acoustic shift is not abrupt but incremental, charting Ega's journey from a world of natural, human sounds into a mechanized soundscape of death, a descent mirrored in Dan Romer's score, which blends melancholic orchestral motifs with harsh, electronic distortion. The musical landscape itself becomes a character, at times a mournful elegy for a lost childhood, and at others a jarring, a tonal shriek that externalizes Ega's internal panic and the irreversible fracturing of his psyche. Ega's relationship with his older brother provides a crucial pre-war dynamic, a mixture of sibling rivalry and deep protective love that grounds Ega's character in the universal, relatable framework of family, making his eventual isolation all the more profound. His brother's crude jokes about sexuality and his teasing about Ega's piety are not mere exposition, but textured character moments that establish Egu as a somewhat naive, spiritually sensitive boy, traits that will later become the last, flickering embers of his humanity that the commandant tries hardest to extinguish. The father's decision to donate his savings to refugee relatives fleeing the conflict is a subtle but essential piece of character development, revealing a man of principle and communal responsibility, which makes the utter futility of his subsequent, defenseless death a bitter, ironic condemnation of the war's disregard for human virtue. The physical performance of Abraham Attah in these early scenes is remarkably contained, his body language loose and unguarded, a stark contrast to the coiled, flinching tension he will later embody, a physicalization of how trauma remaps a child's relationship to space and touch. When the first distant gunshots are heard, Attah's posture changes instantaneously, a tightening of the shoulders and a widening of the eyes that is not acting but a pure, instinctual channeling of primal fear. A testament to Fukunaga's ability to create a set environment so immersive that the reactions of his non-professional cast became documentary truth. The film's treatment of the mother's escape is a masterful exercise in restraint. The chaos of the separation is rendered in a blur of motion and muffled screams, the camera darting like a panicked animal, refusing to grant the audience the comfort of a clear, composed farewell. The jungle into which Ega flees is not the romanticized, sublime wilderness of colonial adventure tales, but a claustrophobic, disorienting green maze where every shadow conceals a potential threat, and the lush vegetation feels less like a refuge than a living, breathing trap. Fukunaga films this transitional space with a shallow depth of field, isolating Egu against a blur of indecipherable foliage, a visual strategy that externalizes his psychological state of profound aloneness and sensory overload. This liminal period in the forest is a dark, inverted fairy tale, a Hansel and Gretel journey where there is no breadcrumb trail home, only a path that leads inevitably into the maw of the witch's house, which in this grim reality is the rebel camp with its charismatic, devouring patriarch. The first appearance of the commandant's battalion, emerging from the treeline in a ragged, menacing procession, is staged with the sudden, terrible majesty of a demonic apparition, their mismatched uniforms and eclectic weaponry creating a visual cacophony that is both absurd and terrifying. Idris Elba's physicality in this introduction is monumental. His gait is a swaggering, long-limbed declaration of ownership over the space, and his voice, a deep, mellifluous instrument, immediately establishes the seductive power that will prove far more dangerous than any gun. The deliberate theatricality of the commandant's self-presentation, complete with his sunglasses, his cigar, and his carefully cultivated aura of rockstar rebellion, reveals a man who understands that power is not merely seized but performed, and that his audience of traumatized orphan children is the most susceptible to this lethal theater. The initiation murder is not depicted as a clean, distant act, but with an excruciating intimacy that implicates the viewer, the camera holding on Ega's trembling hand and the victim's terrified eyes, a shared gaze that forges a pact of horror between the killer, the killed, and the witness. The commandant's hand on Ega's shoulder, guiding the machete, is a grotesque perversion of a father teaching his son a craft, a physical collaboration in murder that binds master and apprentice in a covenant of shared blood guilt from which there can be no easy extrication. This moment functions as the film's anti-baptism, a ritual drowning not in holy water but in gore, after which Egu is given a new name, a soldier's name, signifying the death of his former self and his rebirth into a new, unnatural family. The naming ceremony that follows, with the commandant bestowing upon Egu the title of Strika, alongside his new silent companion, is a chilling mimicry of religious confirmation, a blasphemous sacrament that consecrates the child's induction into the church of violence. The film's attention to the specific, tactile details of the child soldier's daily existence, the sharing of looted cigarettes, the rough housing that oscillates between play and sudden cruelty, the communal eating of meager rations, builds a complex, credible portrait of a social microcosm governed by the commandant's capricious law. These children are not monolithic victims. They are a hierarchy of bullies, jokers, and lost souls, and this internal differentiation serves to highlight the insidious way the system co-opts each personality type, turning the joker into a sadist and the lost soul into a fanatic. Strika's muteness is never explained, which is a sophisticated narrative choice. It compels the viewer to project a multitude of possible traumas onto his silence, making him a living screen for our worst imaginings, while simultaneously highlighting the inadequacy of language to encompass the horror these children have endured. The bond between Egu and Strika develops through a grammar of small gestures, a shared glance, a proffered piece of food, the simple act of sleeping back to back, a silent dialect of solidarity that represents the last, fragile outpost of tenderness in a world engineered to extinguish it. Their friendship is the film's lone, flickering candle of hope, and Fukunaga nurtures its flame with quiet, observant patience, which makes its eventual, brutal extinguishment one of the most devastating narrative turns in contemporary cinema. The psychedelic battle sequence, soaked in a hellish red filter that transforms the jungle into a pulsating, infernal vision, is a bravura piece of subjective filmmaking that abandons objective reality to plunge the audience directly into Attah's chemically altered consciousness. The slow-motion slaughter that unfolds in this crimson nightmare is not meant to be processed as tactical action, but as an emotional and sensory apocalypse, a visual poem of pure terror where the boundaries between self, enemy, and environment dissolve into a bloody, hallucinatory soup. This stylistic rupture in the film's otherwise gritty realism is a calculated risk that pays off profoundly, arguing that realism is an insufficient tool for depicting a child's drugged participation in massacre. Only expressionistic nightmare can approach the truth of such an experience. The aftermath of the battle, with the children wandering in a daze through the carnage they have wrought, is filmed with a flat, affectless exhaustion that is more chilling than the violence itself, a portrait of souls in a state of profound, chemical come-down and moral vacancy. The commandant's post-battle speech, praising his brave soldiers and promising them the spoils of war, reveals the economic engine that drives the atrocity, a primitive form of accumulation by dispossession where children are the unpaid, expendable labor force. His rhetoric masterfully blends the language of revolutionary liberation with the promise of personal enrichment, a toxic cocktail of idealism and greed that has fueled countless real-world conflicts. And Elba delivers it with a conviction so potent it nearly seduces the audience into forgetting the mountain of corpses on which he stands. The film's detailed depiction of the battalion's camp, a squalid, temporary village of tents and lean-tos, captures the paradoxical domesticity of a mobile death squad, where laundry is hung to dry next to racks of AK-47s and cooking fires burn beside piles of looted ammunition. The women who inhabit the camp exist in a peripheral, deeply vulnerable space, their presence a silent testament to the sexual economy of warfare that the film acknowledges without ever exploiting, a shadow narrative of suffering that runs parallel to Attah's own. Fukunaga's camera does not dwell on their abuse, but registers their haunted faces and guarded postures, a respectful restraint that paradoxically makes the implied horror more potent by placing it within the viewer's inferential responsibility. The commandant's relationship with his personal boy attendant, a teenager who serves as a combination of squire and sexual servant, is rendered through a series of loaded glances and ambiguous intimacies that are profoundly unsettling in their subtlety, forcing the audience to read between the lines of a predatory dynamic. This attendant's eventual fate, a forgotten footnote in the battalion's implosion, underscores the utter disposability of all the children in the commandant's orbit, each one a replaceable cog in a machine that will grind them up with complete indifference. The film's refusal to grant this character a dramatic death scene is a bitter, Brechtian choice that emphasizes the statistical, anonymous nature of the tragedy it is recounting. The slow-motion disintegration of the battalion, driven by starvation and the supreme leader's strategic neglect, is a masterful study in how the material base of a fighting force determines its morale and cohesion, a Marxist lesson in the primacy of logistics over ideology. The commandant's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his authority, shifting from inspirational rhetoric to snarling menace to wheedling negotiation, chart the complete collapse of a charismatic leader who has lost his ability to deliver on the most basic promises of food and safety. Elba's performance in these later scenes strips away the glamour to reveal a pathetic, frightened man clinging to a power that has become purely performative, a hollow king presiding over a starving court. The starvation that grips the camp is rendered with a visceral physicality, the camera lingering on the distended bellies and listless eyes of the children, a slow-motion atrocity that is more agonizing to witness than the sudden violence of combat. In this context, the theft of food becomes the highest crime, and the execution of the hungry soldier who steals is a stark illustration of how the commandant's regime, ostensibly formed to fight an oppressive government, has simply replicated the same brutal logic of scarcity and punishment on a smaller scale. Attah's gradual realization that he is fighting not for a cause, but for the commandant's personal survival and enrichment constitutes the film's political awakening, a dawning, bitter consciousness that shatters the last vestiges of his indoctrinated belief. The character of Rambo evolves from a silent enforcer into the film's unlikely instrument of pragmatic rebellion, his mutiny motivated not by a moral epiphany, but by the simple, animal calculus of survival, a choice that deprives the revolt of any heroic sheen. The showdown between Rambo and the Commandant is a clash of two distinct models of authority, one based on ideological charisma and the other on brute, physical necessity, and the latter's victory is a grim commentary on the triumph of materialism over mystique in the ultimate reckoning of war. The Commandant's survival of this mutiny, wounded but alive, wandering off into the jungle, is a deliberate denial of catharsis. The monster is not slain, only displaced, ready to regenerate in some new, fertile ground of chaos. Aga's solo flight from the disintegrated battalion is a passage through a landscape that functions as a psychological projection. The jungle now an empty, echoing cathedral of memory where he is haunted by the ghosts of his father, his brother, and the man he was forced to kill. The hallucinated conversations he holds with these specters are not a sign of madness, but a desperate, internal effort at a trial of conscience. A solitary soul attempting to process an accumulation of trauma that would shatter a mature adult, let alone a child. These sequences are among the most experimental in the film, blending reality and hallucination with a fluid, dreamlike logic that is the only appropriate aesthetic for the subjective experience of profound, unintegrated trauma. The arrival at the UN-monitored camp is a moment of surreal transition, where Agu emerges from the primal, lawless jungle into a world of barbed wire, white vehicles, and procedural bureaucracy, a shift that feels less like a rescue and more like an abduction by an alien, incomprehensible order. The peacekeepers, in their sunglasses and body armor, are as foreign and intimidating to Agu as the soldiers were, their impassive professionalism a different, but equally dehumanizing face of the conflict's international management. The handover of Agu to the missionary shelter is a cold, transactional process, a boy being processed like a piece of ordnance, and the film refuses to infuse this moment with the warm glow of salvation. The missionary shelter, with its tiled floors, its scheduled meals, and its orderly dormitories, represents a radical, disorienting shift in the film's aesthetic, the wild, organic textures of the jungle replaced by sterile, institutional geometries. This stark architectural change externalizes the psychological challenge of reintegration. How does a soul, shaped by the chaos of the forest and the battlefield, learn to inhabit the rigid, peaceful structures of civilian life? Aga's physical awkwardness in this space, his inability to make eye contact or accept casual touch, is a quiet, devastating performance note from Attah that communicates the profound, somatic alienation of the traumatized survivor. Amy, the white aid worker played with a weary, professional compassion, becomes the focal point for the film's exploration of the limits of Western humanitarian intervention. Her well-meaning questions and therapeutic exercises colliding with the granite wall of Aga's unspeakable experience. Her offer of counseling and her gentle prompts to talk about his feelings represent a cognitive approach to healing that feels almost absurdly inadequate in the face of the primal, embodied nature of Aga's trauma. The film does not mock her efforts. It simply, honestly, dramatizes the immense, almost unbridgeable gulf between the language of clinical recovery and the lived reality of a child who has been a killer, a victim, and a beast. The group therapy sessions at the shelter, with their circles of traumatized boys and their rote recitations of forgiveness and renewal, are depicted with an ambivalence that refuses to either endorse or condemn their efficacy, presenting them simply as the only available, imperfect tools for a reconstruction project of staggering difficulty. Aga's silence in these circles is a powerful form of resistance, a refusal to dilute his experience into the neat, therapeutic narratives being offered, a silence that holds the truth of his journey more faithfully than any confession could. The film suggests that true healing, if it is possible at all, will not be found in the recitation of formulas but in the slow, painful, nonverbal reconstruction of trust, safety, and the capacity for play. The scene where Agu finally breaks his silence to attack a boy who teases him is a terrifying, necessary eruption. A reminder that the Commandant's conditioning is not a garment that can be simply removed but a deep, neurological rewiring that lies dormant, ready to be triggered. The horrified reaction of the shelter staff, who restrain him with a mixture of fear and pity, is a moment of bitter truth for Agu, a confirmation that the beast he was made into is still inside him, that his reintegration into the world of normal children is not guaranteed. This violent outburst is the film's most direct challenge to the sentimental notion of rescue, arguing that saving a child soldier is not a singular event, but a precarious, lifelong process haunted by the constant threat of relapse. The film's final monologue, delivered by Agu in a static, unbroken shot that fills the frame with his face, is a sublime fusion of actor and character, a moment where the boundary between performance and confession seems to dissolve, creating an intimacy that is almost unbearable. Attah's vocal delivery in this speech is a delicate instrument, his voice wavering between the timbre of a traumatized child and the hard-won, premature wisdom of an old man, a vocal duality that encapsulates the film's central tragedy of stolen time. His words, describing how his heart grew hard and how he became a beast who had no nation, constitute a self-authored creation myth, a story that explains how the unthinkable happened, and in the telling of it, begins the long work of reclaiming authorship over his own life. The line, "If I am telling this to you, you will think that I am some sort of beast or devil," is a direct metatextual address that implicates the audience in the act of judgment, forcing us to confront our own potential for dehumanizing the very victim we have been pitying. His subsequent assertion that he is a man who did these things is a staggering act of moral self-possession, a refusal of the exculpatory language of victimhood in favor of a more complex, more honest accounting that acknowledges both his coercion and his agency. This is the film's most profound and uncomfortable ethical move, denying the audience the easy comfort of seeing Egu as purely innocent and forcing us to hold the tension of a child who is simultaneously a victim of atrocity and a perpetrator of it. The visual composition of this final shot, with Egu centered against a soft, out-of-focus natural background, the light catching the liquid in his eyes, is a portrait of emerging, fragile consciousness, a human face slowly, painfully learning to bear the weight of its own history. The camera does not flinch from his tears, nor does it exploit them. It simply holds space, a steady, compassionate witness that is the cinematic equivalent of the ideal listener, offering not judgment or easy consolation, but a profound, silent acknowledgement. This stillness, after the frantic, handheld chaos of the battle sequences, is a formal release, a visual and somatic exhale that allows the viewer, alongside Egu, to finally stop running and simply be. The subsequent, final scene at the ocean is a work of pure lyrical grace, the children shedding their donated, ill-fitting Western clothes and running naked into the surf, a collective baptism that echoes and reverses the blood baptism of Egu's initiation. The frolicking in the waves is not a naive return to innocence. The scars on their bodies and the shadows in their eyes remain, but a tentative, joyful assertion of the body's capacity for something other than violence and labor, a rediscovery of the simple, physical pleasure of being alive. The frame freezes on Egu mid-laugh, a suspended moment of childhood recaptured, and this freeze frame is a deliberate, generous act of cinematic grace, a filmmaker granting his character a permanent, eternal instant of peace to counterbalance the horrors that came before. The sound of the ocean, a vast, rhythmic, non-human roar, replaces the bass of the bombs and the gunfire, a natural, cleansing soundscape that suggests a world far older and more enduring than the petty, brutal conflicts of men. This audio reset is a profound psychic relief, a signal to the viewer's nervous system that the assault is over, and in this release, the film performs its ultimate empathetic function, allowing the audience to viscerally experience, in its own body, the transition from trauma to the possibility of recovery. The ambiguity of the ending, we do not know if Egu will become a doctor, if he will heal, if he will relapse, is the film's final, honest refusal of a lie, a commitment to the open-ended, uncertain nature of true survival that is far more respectful to real survivors than any neatly tied narrative bow. The film's treatment of religion is a complex and unresolved dialectic, presenting Egu's faith initially as a source of childish comfort, then as a framework of intense guilt and terror as he fears God's damnation for his sins, and finally, in the closing monologue, as a point of reference in his self-accounting without offering easy divine absolution. His question, "God, can you see me?" is the central theological cry of the film, a plea from the abyss for a witnessing that seems perpetually absent, and the film refuses to answer it, leaving Egu and the audience in the radical uncertainty of a silent heaven. This silence is not cynicism, but a profound theological honesty, a recognition that any easy answer would be a betrayal of the depth of the suffering depicted. The recurring motif of the television, from the imaginative play of the opening to the real, flickering screens in the captured towns, becomes a complex symbol of the world outside, a world of mediated reality that continues its existence in blissful ignorance of the unspeakable realities being lived in the jungle. Egu's childhood game of creating an imaginary TV show was a rehearsal of normalcy and the later intrusion of real televisions, often broadcasting static or propaganda, represents the corruption of that imaginative space by the adult world's machinery of lies and distraction. The contrast between the children's creative play and the commandant's manipulative performance on the stage of war is a subtle meditation on the difference between innocent and malignant fictions. Fukunaga's decade-spanning research, including his direct immersion in the landscapes and testimonies of Sierra Leone, infuses every frame with an ethical weight, a sense of profound responsibility to the real-life counterparts of the fictional Egu. The film never feels like an act of cultural tourism. It feels like a committed, desperate attempt to use the tools of narrative cinema to bridge an experiential gulf, to make physically present to a distant, comfortable audience a truth that is otherwise contained in statistics and unread reports. This sense of mission, of cinema as a tool for radical empathy, is the engine that drives the film's most difficult, unflinching passages, justifying their brutality not as entertainment, but as a necessary, painful act of collective witnessing. The history of the film's reception is inextricable from its political and industrial context. The Academy's snub now widely read as a defensive maneuver by a traditional industry terrified of Netflix's disruptive, direct-to-consumer model, a corporate battle fought over the body of a film about exploited, forgotten children. This irony is a bitter and perfect coda to the film's themes, demonstrating in the real world how systems of power protect their own interests, even at the cost of ignoring extraordinary artistic and human achievement. The controversy ensures that Beasts of No Nation is remembered not just as a great film, but as a historical pivot point. The work that drew the battle lines for the streaming wars that have since reshaped the entire landscape of film production and consumption. The casting process in Ghana, with its street-level search for authentic faces and its intensive, playful workshops, was not merely a production necessity, but an ethical methodology, a way of working that sought to protect the children from the psychological dangers of the material by building a foundation of trust, play, and ensemble solidarity. Fukunaga's approach of integrating games and improvisation into the rehearsal process was a form of psychological scaffolding, allowing the children to access dark emotions within a structured, safe container that they understood as a professional, collaborative game. This behind-the-scenes labor, invisible in the final product, is the film's hidden moral foundation, the reason it can achieve such devastating authenticity without becoming an act of exploitation itself. The long-term trajectory of Abraham Attah's life, from the streets of Ghana to a scholarship at a prestigious American boarding school and a role in a major superhero franchise, is a living epilogue that extends the film's narrative of recovery into the real world, offering a concrete, hopeful counter-narrative to the fictional Ega's uncertain future. The film's legacy, therefore, is not merely aesthetic but profoundly human, a work of art that directly and measurably altered the life course of its young star, an outcome that feels like a small, redemptive miracle in the context of a story otherwise so steeped in despair. This happy accident of biography lends the film an additional layer of meaning, a reminder that the act of creating art, even art about the darkest subjects, can generate unforeseen and luminous consequences. The marketing and distribution of the film, with its simultaneous global release on Netflix, bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of film festivals and art house cinemas to place a brutal African war drama directly into the living rooms of millions of viewers worldwide, a democratic distribution strategy that aligned with the film's moral purpose of raising mass consciousness. This accessibility was a radical political act in itself, forcing an algorithmically recommended confrontation with uncomfortable subject matter into the casual browsing habits of an audience that might never have purchased a ticket. The global conversation the film ignited, spanning from critical accolades to parental outrage over its age rating, is a testament to its success in using the new digital infrastructure to achieve the old-fashioned, humanist goal of sparking widespread, difficult dialogue. The physical setting of the film, shot on location in Ghana, is never merely a backdrop but an active participant in the drama, the dense forests, wide rivers, and dusty roads becoming a topography of trauma that is mapped onto Ega's body and memory. The heat is almost palpable on screen, the sweat on the actor's skin a constant, glistening reminder of the physical duress of their existence, a material reality that grounds the film's more expressionistic flights in a gritty, undeniable physicality. This haptic visual quality, the sense that you can almost feel the humidity and the dust, is a key component of the film's immersive power, drawing the viewer into a sensory world that is complete and overwhelming. The film's structure functions as a dark Bildungsroman, a novel of formation that charts the development of a soul in reverse, from a state of integrated, hopeful potential to one of fragmented, desolate experience, and then in its final, tentative movements, gestures toward a new, more complex and scarred form of adult formation. This inversion of the classic coming-of-age story is the film's master narrative stroke, using a familiar, beloved literary framework to guide the audience through an utterly unfamiliar and unloved reality, the genre itself becoming a source of violated comfort. We watch Ega grow, but what grows is not his understanding of the world's goodness, but his initiation into its most profound and systematic cruelty. The use of language in the film, a fluid mix of English and various Ghanaian dialects, is a political map of the colonial legacy that underpins the unnamed conflict. The commandant's speech is often delivered in the polished, educated English of a former colonial subject, while the intimate, terrified exchanges of villagers occur in their mother tongues. This linguistic stratification reveals the power dynamics that survive decolonization, a hierarchy where access to the colonizer's language remains a tool of authority and manipulation, wielded by a man who has perfectly learned the rhetorical tricks of his former masters. Ega's narration, delivered in a Creole-inflected English, becomes a voice from the borderland, a hybrid tongue that tells a story of a world fractured by the collision of cultures and the violence of history. The film's status as a war film that deliberately refuses the pleasures of the genre, no heroic sacrifices, no clear strategic victories, no triumphant music swelling over a flag, positions it as a definitive anti-war statement, a document that makes the experience of combat so viscerally repellent that it functions as a vaccine against martial romanticism. Every convention of the Hollywood war movie is systematically dismantled, replaced by a stark, procedural depiction of violence as messy, random, and utterly devoid of meaning, a senseless expenditure of human life for causes that are either hollow or completely opaque to the men and children fighting for them. This generic cleansing is one of Fukunaga's most significant achievements, purging the cinematic language of its ingrained, often unconscious, militaristic bias. The ghost of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness haunts the film, not as a direct adaptation, but as a deep, archetypal echo in the journey down a river of madness toward a charismatic, insane leader whose authority is a sham, and in Ega's position as a Marlowe-like witness who returns to civilization with a truth too dark to easily communicate. However, Fukunaga crucially revises Conrad's Eurocentric gaze by making the witness not a European sailor, but an African child, decentering the colonial perspective and reclaiming the narrative of atrocity for the person who is its direct, primary victim, not its horrified external observer. This shift is a profound act of narrative decolonization, using the template of a canonical Western text to tell a story that challenges the very framework of the civilization that produced it. The film's unblinking focus on the child's body, its vulnerability, its capacity for suffering, its transformation into a weapon, and its potential for healing, makes it a powerful contribution to a cinema of embodied ethics, one that argues that moral questions cannot be abstracted from the physical reality of human flesh. Every wound, every scar, every trembling lip and vacant stare is an ethical argument, a mute testimony that demands a response from the viewer that goes beyond intellectual analysis into the realm of visceral, somatic empathy. This is a film that thinks with the body, that knows that the deepest philosophical truths about war, innocence, and evil are not located in the mind alone, but are inscribed on the skin and held in the nervous system of those who survive. The color grading of the film's final act, a gradual, almost imperceptible shift from the desaturated, harsh contrasts of the jungle and the camp toward a more balanced, naturalistic light in the shelter and the final beach scene, is a subtle, subliminal cue of psychological movement toward a possible equilibrium. The light itself becomes a character, a marker of hope that is not spoken but felt, a visual promise that the darkness, while never fully banished, is not the totality of the visible world. This mastery of the digital intermediate process, the ability to sculpt the emotional tone of a scene through color alone, confirms Fukunaga's status as a complete cinematic author, a director who understands that every pixel on the screen is a vessel for meaning. The final, frozen wave that holds Ega's laughter forever in suspension is a gift to him and to the audience, a permanent, crystalline monument to joy that stands in defiant, beautiful contrast to the river of blood through which he has waded. It does not erase the past, but it offers a parallel, equally real image of existence, a claim that life, even a life as shattered as Ega's, still contains the potential for moments of such pure, unalloyed release. In this single, generous frame, Beasts of No Nation declares its ultimate, hard-won humanism, a belief not in the erasure of trauma, but in the stubborn, miraculous persistence of the child's capacity to play, to laugh, and to be, against all odds, simply and profoundly alive. The film opens with a prologue of childhood imagination so vivid and tactile that it functions as a thesis statement, a declaration that before the war, before the machete and the gun, there existed a world of pure, inventive joy where a hollowed-out gourd could become a television and a stick could become a microphone. This act of transformative play is the first and most important political argument the film makes, insisting that the children we will later see committing unspeakable acts were not born as monsters, but as creators, as artists of their own small, bounded universe. Fukunaga's camera captures this play not with the nostalgic haze of adult memory, but with the immediate, bright-eyed presence of a fellow participant, crouching at the children's level and moving with their restless, darting energy. The sound design of this prologue is a carefully constructed tapestry of innocence, the laughter of children layered over the rhythmic, reassuring percussion of daily village labor, a sonic world that the film's later passages of gunfire and screaming will systematically annihilate. This acoustic Eden is broken by the first distant rumble of an explosion, a sound that arrives not as a sudden shock, but as a low, ominous vibration felt more than heard. The subwoofer frequencies communicating to the viewer's body a threat that the characters' conscious minds have not yet registered. The transition from this world of human, organic sound to the mechanical, deafening roar of war is the film's fundamental sonic arc, a journey from a world where sound signifies life and community to one where sound signifies only death and disintegration. Aga's relationship with the Bible, gifted by his mother and clutched throughout his ordeal, is a narrative through line that charts the transformation of religious faith from a source of childhood comfort into a tormenting instrument of guilt and finally into a mute, enigmatic object of a hope that has been stripped of all doctrinal certainty. The book itself becomes a physical talisman, its pages growing increasingly worn and blood-stained, a material record of the journey that parallels Aga's own body, both texts inscribed with the history of violence. In the shelter, when Aga finally places the Bible down, it is not an act of apostasy but a quiet, exhausted acceptance that the answers he seeks are not to be found in its pages, that he must now author his own story of sin and possible redemption. The Commandant's introduction is a masterclass in the choreography of menace, his long, loping stride through the gathered ranks of his child army, a physical proclamation of ownership that recalls the territorial patrols of an alpha predator surveying its domain. Elba's vocal performance in this sequence is a study in controlled, seductive authority, his deep, mellifluous baritone wrapping around the children like a warm, dangerous blanket, offering the promise of protection and belonging in exchange for absolute fealty. The sunglasses he wears are not merely a costume detail, but a crucial dramatic tool, the opaque lenses preventing the children and the audience from reading his eyes, creating a void of intention into which both the boys and the viewer project their own desperate needs for a father, a savior, a leader. The initiation murder, the forced killing of the unarmed engineer, is structured as a dark Eucharist, the commandant acting as a perverse priest who consecrates the machete, guides the trembling hand, and then proclaims the child reborn as a soldier in the blood of the sacrificed. The victim's final plea, a desperate, gurgling profession of his own identity and skills, is a futile assertion of personhood in the face of a ritual designed precisely to annihilate the recognition of the other's humanity. Aga's hand, forced to grip the machete by the commandant's larger, stronger hand, becomes the site of a violent transference, the moment when the moral agency of the child is physically overwritten by the will of the patriarch, a bodily inscription of the power dynamic that will define their entire relationship. The subsequent naming of Agu as a soldier, stripping him of his given name and bestowing upon him a war name, is an act of ontological violence that severs the child from his lineage, his family, and his former self, a symbolic murder that completes the physical one. This renaming is a tool of total institutions everywhere, from prisons to cults, a method of breaking down the prior identity to make the subject malleable for the new, imposed identity that the institution requires. The film understands that to make a child capable of killing, you must first kill the child, and this linguistic death is the opening salvo in a sustained campaign of psychic demolition. Stryka's character is one of the film's most profound inventions, a boy whose trauma has manifested not in screams or tears but in a total, impenetrable silence that is louder and more eloquent than any dialogue could ever be. His muteness is a form of radical refusal, a last desperate act of self-preservation that consists of withholding his interiority entirely from a world that has only ever inflicted pain, a silence that is both a prison and a fortress. The moments when Stryka does communicate, through a drawn picture or a mimed gesture, carry an almost unbearable emotional weight, each small sign a monumental effort of trust from a soul that has been shattered into a million silent pieces. The drug-taking rituals that precede the battalion's attacks are depicted not as moments of wild, hedonistic abandon, but as grim, functional preparations for atrocity. The children lining up like workers at a factory gate to receive their chemical tools. The substances, gunpowder mixed with cocaine, heroin, or whatever is available, are administered with a casual, bureaucratic efficiency that is more chilling than any orgy of excess, the reduction of psychedelic experience to a simple tool of labor discipline. This perversion of the countercultural, liberatory associations of drug use into a technology of enslavement and dehumanization is one of the film's bitterest ironies. The hallucinatory battle sequence, soaked in an infernal red wash that transforms the familiar green of the jungle into a pulsating, visceral nightmarescape, is a cinematic translation of the drug experience that prioritizes emotional truth over pharmacological accuracy. The slow-motion slaughter that unfolds in this crimson hell is not meant to be followed as tactical action, but felt as a sensory apocalypse, a total dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, friend and enemy, victim and perpetrator. Fukunaga's decision to shoot this sequence with such radical stylistic departure from the film's prevailing realism is an assertion that ordinary cinematic language is inadequate to the task of representing a child's chemically altered experience of massacre. Only the grammar of nightmare, of expressionist horror, can approach the truth. The aftermath of the battle, the dazed wandering through the smoking ruins of the captured village, is a portrait of souls in a state of profound spiritual hangover, the chemical courage having drained away to leave only a flat, affectless exhaustion that is more terrifying than the preceding frenzy. The children move through the carnage they have created like sleepwalkers, their eyes registering the bodies and the blood with a disturbing blankness that testifies to the drug's efficacy in severing the connection between perception and emotional response. This is the true horror of the pharmacological dimension of the conflict. It does not make the children enjoy killing so much as it makes them incapable of caring that they have killed, a chemical lobotomy of the conscience. The commandant's post-battle speech, delivered over the spoils of the conquered village, is a masterpiece of manipulative oratory that blends the promise of material reward with the language of revolutionary liberation, a toxic cocktail of greed and idealism that has fueled countless real-world atrocities. His rhetoric transforms the sacking of a peasant village into a glorious blow against an oppressive regime, the stolen grain and looted possessions rebranded as the just spoils of a righteous struggle. The children, hungry and traumatized, are in no position to interrogate this narrative. They cling to it as a drowning man clings to driftwood, their desperate need for meaning making them perfect vessels for propaganda. The film's depiction of the battalion's internal economy, the distribution of food, the hierarchy of loot, the sexual access to the camp women, reveals the material base that underpins the commandant's ideological superstructure, a primitive system of patronage and reward that binds the soldiers to him through their bellies and their basest desires. When this material base collapses, when the food runs out and the supreme leader cuts off supplies, the ideological edifice crumbles with it, exposing the revolutionary rhetoric as a hollow shell that cannot fill an empty stomach. This is the film's most cynical and perhaps most accurate political observation, that the loyalties of armed men are ultimately purchased not with ideas but with resources, and that the leader who cannot provide is a leader who will be deposed. The slow starvation of the battalion is rendered with a harrowing, documentary precision, the camera lingering on the physical deterioration of the children's bodies with an unblinking, clinical gaze that transforms their frames into a record of privation. Their eyes grow hollow, their movements become sluggish, and their skin takes on a dull, ashen quality that is the visual signature of impending death by malnutrition. This slow, creeping horror is in some ways more difficult to watch than the sudden violence of combat, a prolonged agony that offers no catharsis, only a grinding, day-by-day erosion of the life force that reduces human beings to shuffling, hollow-eyed specters of themselves. The mutiny led by Rambo is a revolution devoid of ideals, a purely pragmatic uprising of starving men against a leader who has failed in his most fundamental duty, to feed his troops. Rambo is not a hero or a liberator. He is simply the strongest of the hungry, the one who dares to translate the general discontent into violent action. And his victory promises not a new and better order, but simply a more competent management of the same brutal system. The film's refusal to sentimentalize the rebellion, to cast it as a righteous overthrow of a tyrant, is a bracing dose of political realism that acknowledges that in the desperate conditions of a failing insurgency, one warlord is much like another. The commandant's survival of the mutiny, limping off into the jungle wounded but alive, is a denial of narrative justice that speaks to a deeper, more disturbing truth. The monsters that war creates do not conveniently die at the end of the story, but slink away to regenerate, to find new children to exploit, new conflicts to fuel, new horrors to perpetrate. His disappearance into the green vastness of the jungle is a visual metaphor for the persistence of evil, its capacity to melt into the background and re-emerge when conditions are again favorable. The audience is left with the unsettling knowledge that the commandant is still out there, somewhere, his charisma and cruelty intact, ready to begin the cycle anew. Aga's solo journey through the jungle after his escape is a passage through a landscape that has become a projection of his psyche, every rustling leaf a potential threat, every shadow a memory of violence, every silence a void into which his guilt threatens to swallow him. The hallucinations that visit him during this trek, his father, his brother, the man he killed, are not mere trauma flashbacks but active dialogic confrontations, his mind staging an internal tribunal in which he is simultaneously the accused, the prosecutor, and the judge. These sequences, with their fluid blending of reality and fantasy, are a bold formal experiment that externalizes the internal chaos of unresolved trauma, making visible the invisible war that continues to rage inside the survivor long after the external conflict has been left behind. The UN peacekeeping convoy that Aga encounters is depicted not as a cavalry of salvation, but as an alien, bureaucratic intrusion, the massive white vehicles and the impassive, sunglassed soldiers representing an international order that is simultaneously powerful and utterly impotent, capable of moving armies, but incapable of understanding the soul of a single traumatized child. The handover process, with its forms and its procedures and its clinical efficiency, reduces Aga to a case file, a statistic in a humanitarian operation, his individual humanity disappearing into the machinery of international aid. The film does not condemn this system. It is, after all, what saves Aga's life, but it does refuse to romanticize it, insisting on the gap between the cold, administrative logic of humanitarian intervention and the warm, messy, specific needs of a damaged child. The missionary shelter, with its white walls and its fluorescent lights and its scheduled activities, represents an architecture of healing that is radically alien to everything Aga has known, a space designed to impose order and routine on the chaos of traumatized minds. The stark, institutional aesthetic of this environment is a visual shock after the organic, earthy textures of the jungle and the village, a shift that externalizes the disorientation of the reintegration process. The sense of having landed on an alien planet where the gravity is different and the air smells wrong. Aga's body, trained for years to be a weapon, to be hypervigilant, to never relax, cannot immediately adapt to this space of safety. His nervous system remains on a war footing, a somatic memory that no amount of white paint and structured routine can quickly erase. The character of Amy, the aid worker, is drawn with a sensitive, honest complexity that avoids both the easy caricature of the white savior and the equally easy cynicism of the useless humanitarian. She is competent and compassionate, but her tools, the counseling sessions, the art therapy, the gentle questions, are revealed to be pathetically inadequate to the depth of the wound she is trying to treat, a spoon with which to empty an ocean. Her frustration, her moments of visible helplessness in the face of Aga's silence and sudden violence, are a truthful depiction of the limits of therapeutic intervention, a recognition that some damage is so profound that it exceeds the capacity of any individual caregiver to repair. The group therapy sessions at the shelter, with their circles of traumatized boys and their guided discussions about feelings and forgiveness, are presented with an ambiguity that respects the complexity of the healing process without either endorsing or dismissing the therapeutic framework. The boys wrote recitations, their flat, affectless repetitions of the language of recovery, suggest a gap between the words they have been taught to say and the reality of their inner lives, a gap that therapy can sometimes bridge, but just as often simply papers over with the appearance of progress. Aga's silence in these circles is a form of integrity, a refusal to perform a recovery he does not yet feel, a holding of space for a truth that has not yet found its words. The scene in which Aga finally attacks a fellow resident who teases him is a terrifying, necessary eruption of the violence that has been programmed into his nervous system. A reminder that the commandant's training is not a software program that can be uninstalled, but a deep, neurological rewiring that lies dormant beneath the surface of compliance. The horror on the faces of the other children, the swift and frightened response of the staff, all serve to underscore the tragic irony. Aga, the victim of unspeakable violence, has himself become a source of fear, his body now carrying the potential for the very brutality that was inflicted upon him. This moment is the film's most challenging meditation on the cycle of trauma, the recognition that the abused so often becomes the abuser, that the line between victim and perpetrator is terrifyingly thin. The final monologue is a work of such extraordinary performative and literary power that it elevates the entire film to the level of tragedy in its classical sense, a moment of recognition and self-knowledge that is both devastating and cathartic. Attah's delivery, with its wavering, uncertain cadences and its sudden, startling moments of firmness, captures the voice of a soul in the process of its own difficult birth, a child struggling to become the author of his own story after years of being a character in someone else's bloody narrative. The words themselves, with their biblical cadences and their unflinching self-accusation, constitute a secular confession, an accounting of sins committed and endured that seeks not absolution but simply the dignity of honest witness. The direct address to the camera, the unwavering eye contact that Attah maintains with the audience, is a formal choice of immense courage and power, shattering the fourth wall to implicate the viewer directly in the act of judgment that the monologue anticipates and defies. Aga is not speaking to a character within the diegesis. He is speaking to us, to the comfortable, distant audience that has watched his suffering from the safety of a cinema seat or a living room couch. This direct address transforms the film from a spectacle to be consumed into a confrontation that demands a response, a question posed to each viewer individually. Now that you have seen what I have endured and what I have done, what will you do with this knowledge? The line in which Aga declares that he is a man who did these things is the ethical and philosophical core of the entire film, a statement that refuses both the exculpatory language of pure victimhood and the damning language of pure monstrosity. To claim manhood is to claim agency, to accept responsibility for actions committed under conditions of extreme coercion, a moral stance that is far more demanding and honest than the simpler narratives of innocence corrupted. The film, through Aga, insists on this complexity, on the necessity of holding the tension between victim and perpetrator in a single, unified act of witness, because to do otherwise would be to deny the full humanity of the child soldier, to flatten him into a symbol rather than to honor him as a person. The ocean scene that closes the film is a baptismal image of immense, quiet power, the children shedding their Western clothes and running naked into the vast, indifferent, cleansing water of the sea. The ocean does not judge, does not ask questions, does not offer therapy. It simply receives them, its cold, rhythmic, eternal embrace, a promise of a world beyond the human world of cruelty and conflict, a nature that predates and will outlast all the armies and all the nations. The freeze frame on Aga's laughing face is an act of cinematic grace, a gift from the filmmaker to his character and to his audience, a permanent, crystalline moment of joy that no subsequent suffering can ever erase, a declaration that even in the darkest hell, a moment of light is possible and is worth recording. The ambiguity of this ending is its greatest strength, a refusal of the false closure that would betray the ongoing, open-ended nature of recovery from complex trauma. We do not know if Aga will become a doctor, if he will ever truly heal, if the nightmares will stop, if the violence inside him will remain dormant or erupt again. The film leaves him suspended in that moment of laughter, a permanent potentiality, a question mark that is also a prayer, a hope that is not a prediction but a possibility, fragile and precious and entirely uncertain. This is the truest ending the film could have offered, an ending that respects the reality of trauma by refusing to pretend that it can be neatly resolved in the space of a narrative. The film's treatment of masculinity is a complex and devastating subtext, tracing the ways in which the commandant's violent, domineering model of manhood is imposed upon the children as a replacement for the gentler, more protective masculinities represented by Aga's father and brother. The father's impotence in the face of the soldiers, his inability to protect his family, is a coded death of a certain kind of masculinity, a failure that the commandant's hypermasculine performance of power explicitly exploits and supplants. The children are taught that to be a man is to kill, to dominate, to feel nothing, a toxic ideal that is presented as the only viable mode of survival in the world of the war, and the film traces the tragic, violent consequences of this indoctrination. The contrasting models of femininity in the film, though less prominent, are equally significant. The mother, who represents a nurturing, life-giving principle that is forcibly exiled from the narrative, and the camp women, who represent the vulnerability of the feminine in a world of unchecked masculine violence, their bodies a territory to be conquered and exploited. The film's awareness of this gendered dimension of warfare, its acknowledgement of the specific forms of suffering inflicted upon women and girls, is conveyed through a restrained, respectful gaze that refuses to turn their pain into spectacle while still insisting on its reality. The mother's absence, the void she leaves, is a wound that never heals, a space of lost love and lost protection that the commandant's corrupt paternalism can never truly fill. The motif of the television, recurring from the imaginative prologue through to the real screens encountered in the occupied towns, becomes a complex symbol of the world outside the conflict, a world of mediated reality that continues its oblivious existence while atrocities unfold beyond its camera's reach. The children's early game of creating an imaginary television show was a rehearsal of normalcy, a way of participating in the global culture from which their poverty and their geography excluded them. The later encounter with real televisions, often broadcasting static or state propaganda, represents the corruption of that dream of connection into a tool of lies and distraction. The gap between the world on the screen and the world outside it, between the image and the reality, is the film's quiet, bitter commentary on the failure of global media to witness, to truly see and respond to, the suffering of the world's most vulnerable. Fukunaga's decision to serve as his own cinematographer is a choice that shapes every frame of the film, collapsing the traditional distance between the director's vision and the camera's eye into a single, unified consciousness. The resulting visual style is one of extraordinary intimacy and fluidity, the camera moving through the space like a participant in the action, not an observer, a ghostly presence that haunts Aga's journey with a desperate, empathetic attention. This fusion of roles is a demanding, almost reckless commitment that few directors attempt on a production of this scale, and its success is a testament to Fukunaga's prodigious technical skill and his profound, almost obsessive dedication to the material. The Steadicam work in the film, particularly in the long tracking shots that follow the battalion through the jungle or Aga through the chaos of a village raid, is a technical achievement of the highest order, creating an unbroken, flowing sense of presence that draws the viewer into the physical reality of the characters. These shots are not merely showing off, they are an ethical and aesthetic choice, a refusal of the safety and comfort of montage, a commitment to staying with the action in real time, to not looking away, to not cutting to a safer, more distant perspective. The physical exhaustion of the Steadicam operator becomes, in a sense, a proxy for the exhaustion of the characters and the audience, a shared bodily experience of the relentless, grinding reality of the war. The editing of the battle sequences, a staccato, percussive assault of images that breaks the spatial coherence of the action into a series of violent, disorienting fragments, is a deliberate strategy to replicate the fractured, traumatic perception of a mind under extreme duress. The viewer, like Egu, cannot form a clear, tactical picture of the battle. We experience it as a series of terrifying, disconnected moments, a sensory blizzard of noise and motion and blood that overwhelms the cognitive capacity for sense-making. This editorial violence is a form of empathy, a way of making the audience feel, in the rhythm of the cutting itself, the cognitive chaos of the child soldier's experience. The film's refusal to subtitle the non-English dialogue is a political and aesthetic strategy that places the audience in the position of the linguistic outsider, denying the comfort of full comprehension and forcing a confrontation with the limits of our own cultural competence. When the villagers plead for their lives in a language we do not understand, their terror is no less palpable for being semantically opaque. Indeed, it may be more so, the raw, panicked music of the voice conveying everything that the untranslated words cannot. This technique is a quiet, powerful rebuke to the expectation that all stories, even stories of African suffering, must be made fully, comfortably accessible to the English-speaking viewer. The The film's position within the history of cinema about Africa is a complex and contested one, with some critics praising its universal humanism and others condemning its decontextualized portrayal of an unnamed, therefore archetypal, African hell. The decision to remove specific national and historical markers is defended as a universalizing gesture, a way of making the story about the global phenomenon of the child soldier rather than about a single, localizable conflict. However, this very universality, critics argue, risks perpetuating a colonial imaginary of Africa as a place of senseless, ahistorical violence, a blank, dark space onto which Western anxieties can be projected without the inconvenience of specific political and historical understanding. The film's engagement with this critique must be inferred from its own internal logic, which emphasizes the subjective, experiential truth of the child's perspective over the objective, analytical truth of political science. Egu does not know the name of the war he is fighting, does not understand its causes or its geopolitical dimensions. His reality is the immediate sensory horror of his own experience, and the film's commitment to this subjective epistemology is both its greatest aesthetic strength and the source of its most significant political vulnerability. The film seems to argue that there is a truth in the child's eye view that is as valid and as necessary as the truth of the historian or the political analyst, a truth of the body and the heart that context can illuminate but never fully contain. The legacy of the film within the broader landscape of war cinema is its insistence on the child as the ultimate victim and symbol of contemporary conflict, a figure whose suffering exposes the complete bankruptcy of the political, religious, and ethnic justifications offered for violence. Before Beasts of No Nation, the child soldier was a figure more often encountered in documentary or in journalism. Fukunaga's achievement was to bring this figure into the realm of narrative art, to give him a face, a voice, and a soul that could not be reduced to a statistic or a photograph. The film's unshakable images have become, for many viewers, the definitive representation of this global tragedy, a cultural touchstone that has shaped the way the world imagines and responds to the phenomenon of children in war. The performances of the entire child cast, not just Abraham Attah, deserve sustained recognition for their extraordinary courage, vulnerability, and artistic achievement, particularly given the harrowing nature of the material and the non-professional backgrounds of most of the actors. These children, recruited from the streets and villages of Ghana, were asked to embody experiences of extreme trauma and violence, and they did so with a raw, unpolished authenticity that trained actors might never have achieved. Fukunaga's ethical approach to directing these children, the workshops, the games, the creation of a safe, trusting ensemble, is the invisible foundation upon which their visible performances rest, a methodology that prioritized their psychological well-being over the demands of the production. The relationship between Egu and the commandant is the film's dark, twisted heart, a bond that encompasses the roles of father and son, master and slave, abuser and victim, teacher and student, all bound together in a pathological intimacy that is the film's most disturbing and most insightful creation. The commandant genuinely seems to care for Egu, in his way, and this twisted affection is far more damaging than simple cruelty would be, because it creates in Egu a reciprocal, confused attachment, a love for his tormentor that complicates any simple narrative of victimization. The film understands that the deepest evil operates not through hate, but through a perversion of love, a mimicry of the bonds of family that uses the child's desperate need for belonging as the very instrument of his destruction. The color palette of the film, graded with a meticulous attention to the emotional temperature of each sequence, moves from the warm, golden, saturated hues of the pre-war village through the desaturated, harsh, high-contrast look of the conflict to the cooler, calmer, more naturalistic light of the shelter and the beach. This visual arc is a subliminal narrative that operates beneath the level of conscious perception, a story told in color that guides the viewer's emotional response with the precision of a symphony conductor. The gradual return of natural light, of a world no longer filtered through the lens of trauma and drugs, is a visual promise of healing that the narrative itself is too honest to state explicitly. The film's opening and closing images form a diptych of childhood, the imaginative play of the prologue balanced against the physical, joyful play of the epilogue, two visions of what it means to be a child separated by an abyss of suffering. In the beginning, play is an act of imagination, of pretending to be something else, a television host or an entertainer. In the end, play is simply the act of running into the water, of feeling the body move for pleasure and not for violence, a return to a more primal, more fundamental form of being. This diptych structure is the film's deepest formal coherence, a narrative arc that is not about the loss of innocence, for innocence is well and truly lost, and the film does not pretend otherwise, but about the possibility, after everything, of a different way of inhabiting a body and a world. The title Beasts of No Nation is finally and fully explicated in Aga's monologue, his confession that he became a beast, a creature without a nation, a thing rather than a person, an animal whose only law is survival and whose only community is the pack. To have a nation is to be a citizen, to have rights, to belong to a social contract that promises protection in exchange for allegiance. To be of no nation is to be stripped of all of this, to be reduced to bare life, to a biological existence that can be extinguished without consequence or record. The film is, in this sense, a study of statelessness as a spiritual and existential condition, a state of being in which the human is reduced to the animal, and the long, slow climb back to personhood, to citizenship in the world of human beings, is the arduous, uncertain journey that the film traces and that the final, frozen laugh holds open as a permanent possibility. The film's prologue, with its children fashioning an imaginary television from discarded trash, is not merely a charming vignette but a profound meditation on the human capacity for narrative self-construction. The same impulse that will later allow Aga to assemble the shattered fragments of his experience into the coherent testimony of his final monologue. This early play with fiction-making establishes storytelling as a survival mechanism, a way of ordering chaos that Aga will desperately need when the chaos becomes not a game, but a living nightmare from which there is no waking. The hollow gourd that serves as a pretend screen is a mirror of the cinema screen on which we watch the film, implicating the act of viewing itself in the complex ethics of representing and consuming stories of distant suffering. The political vacuum in which the film unfolds, the unnamed nation without a government, without a history, without a map, is not an absence but a presence, a character defined by its radical negativity, its failure to exist as a protective, nurturing entity for its most vulnerable citizens. This absence of the state is the foundational condition that makes all the subsequent horror possible, a void into which the commandant and his ilk step with their machetes and their promises, filling the vacuum of legitimate authority with the brutal, charismatic authority of the warlord. The film argues, implicitly but powerfully, that the child soldier is not a natural phenomenon but a political one, a symptom of a profound failure of governance, of the social contract shattered into a million pieces and left for children to crawl over with bleeding hands and feet. The specific, tactile details of the commandant's self-presentation, the rakish tilt of his beret, the lazy curl of smoke from his ever-present cigar, the precise, theatrical way he removes his sunglasses before delivering an important pronouncement, amount to a masterclass in the semiotics of power, a carefully curated visual language that communicates authority, confidence, and a kind of brutal glamour to an audience of traumatized, suggestible children. Every element of his costume and his gesture is a choice, a deliberate construction of a persona that is larger than life, more vivid than the drab, terrifying reality of the war, a fiction of invincibility designed to inspire awe and suppress doubt. Elba's physical performance, the way he occupies space with a languid, predatory ease, fills this constructed persona with a terrifyingly credible inner life, a sense that the commandant himself half believes his own mythology. The relationship between the commandant and the distant, bureaucratic supreme leader introduces a crucial structural dimension to the film's analysis of power, revealing the chain of exploitation that extends far beyond the jungle encampment to shadowy figures in air-conditioned rooms who profit from the chaos without ever dirtying their hands. The commandant, for all his local godlike authority, is himself a servant, a middle manager of violence whose budget can be cut and whose life can be terminated at the whim of a superior he has never even met. This revelation of his subordination is a moment of profound dramatic irony, exposing the pathos beneath the monster, the desperate, scrambling ambition of a man who is as trapped in the system as the children he commands, though his cage is considerably more comfortable. The supreme leader's casual dismissal of the commandant's request for supplies and recognition, delivered in a brief, distracted meeting that the commandant has traveled miles to attend, is a devastating portrayal of the callousness of remote power, the indifference of those who declare wars to the lives of those who actually fight them. The meeting is a study in the asymmetry of attention, the commandant desperate and earnest, pours all his charismatic energy into a plea that the supreme leader barely acknowledges, his eyes already on the next deal, the next conflict, the next profit margin. This single scene does more to explain the political economy of the conflict than any amount of exposition could, dramatizing the cold, transactional logic that reduces human lives to balance sheet entries. The film's sound design during the sequences of extreme violence employs a technique of selective auditory focus, amplifying certain sounds: the wet, percussive thud of a machete blow, the ragged, desperate intake of breath before a scream, while muting others, creating a surreal, heightened sonic environment that mirrors the dissociative state of the traumatized witness. This manipulation of the soundscape is not a distortion of reality, but an excavation of its subjective texture. The way the mind under extreme stress latches onto certain sensory details with hallucinatory clarity, while the broader context dissolves into a muffled, distant hum. The viewer, like Egu, experiences the atrocity not as a coherent event, but as a series of isolated, unbearable sensory fragments. The recurring image of the road, the dusty, rutted track that connects the village to the jungle to the town, becomes a visual leitmotif of transit and transition, a liminal space where characters are perpetually in motion, fleeing, advancing, escaping, but never arriving at a stable destination. The road is the artery of the war, the path along which violence travels and along which refugees stumble, a symbol of the rootlessness and displacement that is the defining experience of the conflict's victims. Egu's journey along these roads, first with his family, then with the battalion, and finally alone, charts his progressive deracination, his severing from every stable point of reference, until the road itself becomes his only home. The cinematography of the road sequences, with their long, deep-focus shots that stretch the dusty track into a distant, hazy vanishing point, evokes a sense of endless, exhausting journey, a pilgrimage without a shrine, an exodus without a promised land. The figures moving along these roads are often reduced to silhouettes against the harsh, bleaching sunlight, their individual features dissolved into archetypal shapes of human migration, a visual universalizing that connects this unnamed conflict to every refugee crisis in human history. Fukunaga's lens captures both the specific, granular texture of the West African landscape and the timeless, mythical quality of human beings in flight, a double vision that is one of the film's most powerful aesthetic achievements. The meals shared by the battalion, the hurried consumption of looted food around campfires, are depicted with a feral, desperate intensity that strips eating of its social, communal, and cultural dimensions, reducing it to the purely animal function of survival. The children eat like wolves, their hands grabbing, their eyes watchful, their bodies tensed for the inevitable moment when the food runs out or a stronger soldier demands their portion. These feeding scenes are a stark counterpoint to the family meals of the pre-war village, where eating was an act of communion, of sharing, of civilization. In the camp, it is a Hobbesian struggle, a war within the war, a microcosm of the brutal competition for resources that defines the entire conflict. The sequence in which the battalion discovers and occupies an abandoned hotel, a relic of some pre-war tourist economy, is a surreal, almost Beckettian interlude in the narrative, a moment of eerie stillness and decay that speaks to the world that existed before the conflict and will perhaps exist after it. The children wander through the empty rooms, the moldering furniture, the faded advertisements for long-vanished pleasures, like ghosts exploring the ruins of a civilization they never knew, their camo-clad, armed bodies a grotesque intrusion into the space of leisure and luxury. The hotel is a mausoleum of globalization, a tomb for the promise of development and integration that the war has definitively, violently shattered. The commandant's behavior in this hotel, his appropriation of the best room, his lounging on the rotting bed like a deposed monarch in exile, reveals the fantasy that drives him, the dream of status and comfort that the revolution was supposed to deliver and that now exists only as a moldering, delusional theater. His performance of luxury in the midst of squalor is both pathetic and terrifying, a glimpse into the psychology of a man whose ambitions have been thwarted and who now plays at being a king while his child soldiers starve in the corridors outside. Elba's performance in this sequence, a mixture of regal entitlement and gnawing desperation, is one of the film's most complex and revealing moments. The film's treatment of the natural environment, the jungle and the river and the vast, indifferent sky, oscillates between two contrasting modes: the beautiful and the hostile, the sublime and the threatening, a duality that reflects the ambivalent role of nature in the conflict. The jungle is at once a refuge, a place of concealment and escape, and a prison, a claustrophobic labyrinth full of hidden dangers. The river is a source of life, of water and fish, and a highway for armed patrols and floating corpses. This refusal to sentimentalize nature, to present it as a pure, redemptive counterpoint to human evil, is a mark of the film's rigorous, unsentimental intelligence. The butterfly that Egu observes during a rare moment of stillness, a fragile, iridescent creature that alights briefly on a leaf before fluttering away, is a brief, luminous intrusion of pure, purposeless beauty into a world of relentless horror. A moment of grace that the film does not comment on or explain but simply, reverently records. This tiny, fluttering epiphany is a reminder of a world beyond the human, a realm of being that exists in serene indifference to the atrocities of war, a nature that continues its ancient, cyclical rhythms while men and boys tear each other apart for reasons they have long forgotten. The butterfly's brief visit is a gift, a tiny, winged ambassador from a universe of peace, and its departure is a quiet, crushing return to the only reality Egu is allowed to inhabit. The use of slow motion in the film is strategic and sparing, reserved for moments of extreme emotional intensity. The drugged massacre, the death of a significant character, the final plunge into the ocean, where the deceleration of time serves to dilate the instant, to hold it open for contemplation, to refuse the easy, rapid passage from event to event that characterizes conventional action cinema. This slowing of the temporal flow is a formal act of resistance against the numbing, accelerating rhythm of atrocity, a way of insisting that this moment, this death, this grief, deserves more than a fleeting frame, deserves to be held, examined, and mourned. The slow motion is the film's way of saying, "Stop, look, do not let this pass into the forgetfulness of montage." The film's dialogue, particularly in the exchanges between the commandant and his soldiers, is rich with the specific, coded language of military and revolutionary culture, a patois of acronyms, slang, and borrowed political rhetoric that creates a dense, credible linguistic universe. The commandant's speeches, with their apocalyptic imagery and their promises of a new order rising from the ashes of the old, draw on the deep well of millenarian and liberationist discourse that has fueled insurgencies across the post-colonial world. This linguistic authenticity, the sense that these characters speak a language forged in the specific crucible of their conflict, is a crucial element of the film's immersive power, a verbal texture as distinctive and as carefully crafted as its visual counterpart. The moment when Egu, in the shelter, is given a new set of clothes, a simple, clean shirt and shorts, is a scene of extraordinary, quiet power. The donning of these garments a ritual of civilian reinvestiture, a symbolic shedding of the soldier's identity and a tentative re-entry into the world of ordinary, peaceful life. The clothes are slightly too big, their colors bright and childish, and Egu's body, which has learned to move with the coiled tension of a fighter, seems awkward and unfamiliar inside them, a visual testament to the distance he has traveled from the boy who once wore such things without thought. This simple act of dressing is a rebirth, a putting on of a new self, and Attah's performance in this scene, a mixture of shyness, confusion, and a tiny, flickering pride, is a masterclass in conveying complex, contradictory emotion through the subtlest of physical adjustments. The shelter's routines, the scheduled meals, and the compulsory schooling and the organized recreation are an attempt to impose a grid of normalcy on the formless, chaotic temporality of trauma, to replace the eternal, anxious present of survival with the structured, forward-looking time of recovery. Egu's resistance to these routines, his sullen withdrawal and his sudden eruptions of violence, is not a sign of ingratitude or pathology, but a symptom of the profound disjunction between the linear, progressive time of therapy and the circular, repetitive time of traumatic memory, which keeps returning unbidden to the same unbearable moments. The film understands that healing is not a march toward a goal but a slow, spiral process, a circling back and a moving forward that happens simultaneously, contradictorily, and at great cost. The moment when the aid worker, Amy, shows Egu a photograph of himself taken upon arrival at the shelter, a gaunt, wild-eyed, hollow-cheeked apparition that he does not initially recognize as his own face, is a brilliant dramatization of the dissociation that is the hallmark of complex trauma, the splitting of the self into a before and an after that cannot be integrated. The photograph is a document, an objective record, but Egu's inability to connect with the image, to recognize the boy in the picture as himself, reveals the depth of the rupture that the war has inflicted on his sense of identity. The photograph becomes a tool of therapy, a way of beginning to bridge the gap between the self that endured the horror and the self that must now learn to live with the memory of it. The film's quiet attention to the other children in the shelter, the boys with their own invisible wounds and their own unspeakable stories, creates a sense of a community of suffering, a fellowship of the broken that is both heartbreaking and, in its way, hopeful. These children, with their different temperaments and their different trajectories of recovery, represent the diversity of responses to trauma, the fact that there is no single, normative path from horror to healing. Some talk, some remain silent, some draw, some fight, and the shelter's task, the impossible necessary task, is to hold space for all of these responses, to provide a container large enough and flexible enough for the infinite variety of human damage. The film's depiction of the international humanitarian apparatus, the UN vehicles and the NGO compounds and the visiting delegations, is a study in the paradox of aid, the simultaneous necessity and insufficiency of the global response to the crisis of the child soldier. The system saves Aga's life, provides him with food and shelter and clothing and therapy, and for this the film is, in its austere way, grateful. But the system also processes him as a case, a statistic, a success story to be deployed in fundraising appeals, and the film's clear, cold eye does not look away from this instrumentalization, the way that even the most well-intentioned aid can reproduce the very dehumanization it seeks to combat. The relationship between the film and its audience, the silent, watching presence that Aga finally addresses directly in his closing monologue, is the ethical core of the entire enterprise, the reason the film exists and the question it poses. What does it mean to watch such suffering, to consume it as entertainment, as art, as education? The film does not provide an easy answer, does not let the audience off the hook with a call to donate or a hashtag or a moment of cathartic tears. It simply, relentlessly, places the image of Aga before us, his face filling the screen, his eyes meeting ours, and asks us to account for our own looking, to take responsibility for the act of witness that the film has made possible. The freeze frame that closes the film, suspending Aga's laughter in a permanent crystalline present, is an act of defiance against the flow of time, a refusal to let this moment of joy pass into the oblivion of the next frame, the next scene, the next tragedy. It is a cinematic version of the ancient human wish to hold on to happiness, to make it last forever, a wish that is all the more poignant for its impossibility, for the knowledge that the freeze will eventually thaw and Aga will have to return to the arduous, uncertain work of living. But for that frozen instant, the film grants him and grants us a reprieve, a moment of pure, uncomplicated being that no subsequent suffering can ever erase or invalidate. The legacy of the film in the lives of its young cast members, the scholarships and the opportunities and the careers that have followed, is a postscript that is not part of the film's text, but that haunts its reception, a real-world counter-narrative that suggests that even in the darkest stories, redemptive possibilities can germinate. The film's production, which could have been an exploitative extraction of performance from vulnerable children, was instead, by all accounts, a nurturing, educational, and transformative experience that left its participants better off than it found them. This off-screen story does not soften the film's brutality, but it does complicate it, adding a layer of grace to the experience of watching, a knowledge that the machinery that produced this vision of hell was itself, in its small way, a vehicle of care. The ethical framework of the film, its refusal to offer easy catharsis or simple moral judgments, is grounded in a profound respect for the complexity of human experience, a recognition that victims can also be perpetrators, that monsters can also be pathetic, that healing is possible but never guaranteed. This moral complexity is the film's greatest strength and the source of its enduring power. The reason it continues to haunt viewers long after more conventional, redemptive narratives of suffering have faded from memory. The film does not tell us what to think or what to feel. It shows us a world and a soul in all their broken, contradictory, and still beating reality, and it trusts us to do the difficult work of response. The silence that follows the film's final frame, the black screen and the rolling credits, is an integral part of the viewing experience, a space that the film deliberately opens for reflection, for grief, for the slow, difficult process of metabolizing what has been witnessed. In the cinema, this silence is a collective experience, a room full of strangers sitting in the dark, each alone with their thoughts and feelings, a temporary community of witnesses bound together by the shared ordeal of the film. On the streaming platform, in the living room or the bedroom, the silence is more private, more solitary, but no less necessary, a pause before the algorithm serves up the next distraction, a moment of stillness that the film demands and that the world rarely provides. The film's place in the history of cinema is secure, not merely as a technical achievement or a showcase for extraordinary performances, but as a moral document, a film that uses the full resources of the cinematic apparatus to make visible, tangible, and unforgettable a reality that the world prefers to ignore. Like the best and most difficult works of art, it does not offer comfort or escape, but rather the harder, more valuable gift of confrontation, an encounter with the worst of what human beings can do and the fragile, stubborn persistence of the human spirit in its aftermath. To watch Beasts of No Nation is to be changed, to have one's field of moral vision permanently expanded, to carry the image of Aga's face, laughing and crying and confessing, into a world that desperately needs the empathy that such images can if we let them cultivate. The baptismal imagery of the final scene, the children plunging into the cleansing, salt-bitter water of the ocean, draws on a deep, archetypal reservoir of symbolism that crosses cultures and religions, the universal human. Intuition that water can wash away not just physical dirt, but spiritual stain. The film does not validate this intuition, does not pretend that a swim in the sea can erase the memory of murder. The scars remain, the trauma persists, the nightmares will return. But it honors the impulse, the deep human need for ritual, for symbolic action, for a gesture that marks a transition, a death and a rebirth, even if the reality of the new life is as uncertain and as difficult as the old one was brutal. The closing credits, rolling over a black screen with Dan Romer's elegiac, unresolved score, offer no relief, no return to normalcy, no reassuring message that the story is over and the world is safe. The music holds a note of suspension, a chord that does not resolve, a melody that does not conclude, a sonic equivalent of the film's open-ended, questioning final gesture. The viewer is left in this suspension, this unresolved dissonance, asked to carry the film's questions out of the theater and into a world where, the film has made clear, children are still being taken, still being trained, still being turned into beasts, while the nations that could protect them look away. The film's ultimate subject, beneath the specifics of civil war and child soldiers and post-colonial politics, is the oldest and most terrible question of human existence. What are we, what is a human being, if we can do such things to each other, if we can make such things of our children? The answer the film offers is not a philosophical proposition, but a face, the face of Abraham Attah as Agu, a face that contains both the capacity for atrocity and the capacity for joy, both the beast and the child, both the confession and the laughter. That face, held in its final, frozen instant, is the film's entire argument, its entire hope, and its entire unanswerable question, offered to us in silence, waiting for the response that only a life, lived in the wake of such images, can begin to provide.